Sam, should we put the gavel down?
I think so. We'll probably get some other people, but
And with that as a beginning, I am going to let Sam do the particular introduction to you because he's the program chair for this month. Sam, take it away.
Mac just came in, so why don't we pause and see if he can give us some humor. Mac, are you able to give us some humor for today?
A sign I saw that said, "It's been a bit of a strange day. First, I found a hat full of money. Then I was chased by an angry man with a guitar."
Okay.
All right. It took me a little too many seconds, but I got it.
Okay, we're lucky enough to have Barbara Shileder with us, and she is a graduate in architecture and has a certificate in historic preservation, both from the University of Hawaii. She's been with Mason Architects for over 30 years. Some of her projects have been Doris Duke's Shangri-La, McKinley High School, and she spoke to us in 2014, I'm trying to go back too far, 2014 on Our Lady of Peace Cathedral, which I learned that the entrance is on 4th Street because that was the main building, or that was the main street. Bishop Street wasn't actually there at the time. Barbara will talk to us about her work preserving plantation housing in Hawaii, and this is the subject of an article that she has written, which will be published in the Architectural Conservation in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. Barbara, the screen is yours.
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me. I just want to acknowledge Virginia's work on the cathedral. She did the historic structures report for that building. It was a beautiful piece of research, so bravo. I'm going to share my screen. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about preserving plantation architecture in Hawaii, but because of this group is architects and engineers, I want to talk about single wall and the future of single wall in Hawaii. Do you see building on Lanai?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to go through a little bit about the establishment of plantations, the housing on plantations for the workers. I'm going to talk a little bit about single wall and then share some case studies. So here we go. Plantations in Hawaii, single wall construction, some of the challenges that we've faced rehabilitating these buildings sensitively, and then run through a handful of case studies, I'm sure most of which, if not all, you'll be familiar with. So sugar came to Hawaii with the Polynesians in their voyaging canoes. It's a canoe crop. They called it ko. The first plantation, successful commercial plantation was established in Koloa in 1835, and it took a little while for sugar to take root. But after the Reciprocity Treaty of 1878, which allowed Hawaiian sugar to enter U.S. markets duty-free in exchange for a coaling berth at Pearl Harbor, the sugar plantations, commercial sugar plantations, expanded rapidly. The native labor force was insufficient for the expansion of the plantations, and between 1890 and about 1940, almost 500,000 people were imported to Hawaii from around the world, primarily Asia, but also from Europe and the Caribbean to work on the plantations. I'm sure people in this group probably have ancestors that were brought to the islands to work in sugar. Early plantation housing was the responsibility of the workers, and people, it was pretty haphazard and catch as catch can. Some of the housing that the early Japanese families in particular lived in was reminiscent of construction throughout the islands, the thatch and such. Starting in about 1890, the plantation started to provide housing for employees, and I think this is AIA Mill. I'm not absolutely positive, but I think that's IA Mill with the Japanese shrine. But you see the small side gable whitewashed buildings with the outbuildings with the outdoor kitchens and bathrooms. They were building very simple constructions like that for the workers in the early days. But what that did was it turned isolated camps into plantation communities. When we talk about plantations in Hawaii, it's important to point out that we're talking about plantation worker housing and not Terra. You know, we're not talking about the manager's houses. We're really talking about the labor force housing. Hawaii Sugar Planters Association stepped in to improve the condition of the workers, and beginning in about 1919 started to provide standardized plans for the plantations to implement to provide decent sanitary housing. The unions were a strong force in the improvement of housing for the agricultural workers as well. Some plantations, like Ewa in particular, individualized their housing stock, and they even hired Hawaii architect Ted Vieira to design many of the buildings. I think this is in Verona Village out in Ewa. So some plantations had nicer housing than others. But you know, these standardized plans, and I've got an example. This is from the 1919 Hawaii Sugar Planters Association standardized plans, floor plan number 8. Kitchen in the building, but the toilet facilities would have been in an outbuilding still at this time. Very common floor plan. They also did plans for duplexes. They had barracks buildings that were linear and H-shaped. They did a range of outbuildings, outdoor kitchens, chicken coops, all sorts of facilities for people on the plantations. I've seen the entire set of plans. It's a hard thing to find. I think it's in the Hamilton Library archives right now. I'd love to get a full set again. They're pretty fascinating. But what's really distinctive with the plantation architecture, it's not just the small size, but the fact that single wall construction was used so prevalently. Single wall, we're all familiar with it. It's fairly ubiquitous here. It's actually fairly rare building type nationally and internationally. Although it wasn't, I'll talk a little bit about the antecedents, but single wall was originally imported for use in plantation housing. It was inexpensive. It was ideal for our client. It used a minimal of materials. It didn't take a lot of skill to put these together at the time. And originally constructed on the plantations. Subsequently, the carpenters, when they left the plantations, they took the skill set out into the community, and we had Lewers and Cook and eventually Hicks Homes and such building tens of thousands of single wall houses throughout the islands, you know, from Kaimuki to Kalihi in particular, and Hilo and elsewhere. This is Wilhelmina Rise. I mean, there's probably half the buildings in that view are single wall at this point. However, after I was just looking at an old code, the 1997 Hawaii amendments to the building code still permitted single wall construction. They called it walls without studs, and it was still permitted in that code, but subsequent to that, you can no longer build new single wall houses. You can repair existing ones, but new construction is not permitted by the code. Sugar and pine, obviously we know that the last plantations closed down in about 2016. There's a good deal of building stock remaining. However, a lot of the plantations, when they closed, they tore down housing. Some were forethinking and provided housing for their retired employees, and we see that in Ewa has done that, Kunia Village and Pineapple Camp has done that, and in Lanai City they've done that. These structures, obviously, they're 80 to 100 years old at this point. They're under threat by age, obsolescence, regulatory and economic factors. And regulatory is primarily not so much zoning, but more building and energy codes have really impacted the retention of single wall in Hawaii. The antecedents of single wall are in the Western world. We still find what's called box or plank frame buildings on the mainland, from New England to the American South and out west. They're fairly rudimentary. They're also known as shanties. You'd find them in railroad camps and mining camps, homesteads and such. This is in Bodie, California. It's an old gold mining town from about the Civil War period. They are a cruder form of what we eventually would be building in Hawaii. They're plank construction, 1 inch or 5/4 inch material, 10 to 12 inches wide with thick battens. It's almost like a continuous stud wall, the amount of material that they were using. But these are in Bodie is now a state park in California, and the homes have been preserved. A lot of them are what I call single board, where there's actually a single wall, and then they sheathe the outside with either horizontal boards or shingle. So it's kind of a double wall, but there's still no frame. The earliest single wall in Hawaii were the board and batten style. This is a drawing that we did when we constructed Hawaii's Plantation Village in Waipahu out by the mill. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the case study. But, the walls are held in shear by the fasteners, everything's nailed into the sill at the bottom. There's usually 1x12 with a thick batten. Simple framed roof. These buildings would originally have been side gabled with a wood shingle roof, whitewashed. Very simple, often no ceilings at the interior. Some of the people that had lived in these talked about having to drape muslin across the ceilings because the rooms were just open to the next room, and there was no privacy. Later, skilled plantation workers, many of them Japanese, they really refined single wall into something that was unique in the islands. And that's this 3/4 inch tongue and groove single wall buildings that are just a study in the economy of materials. It's like, I don't know how you could possibly strip out any more and still have a structure. They're phenomenal constructions. And this is what we've seen, Lewis and Cook building, Hicks Homes, rebuilding them up until the 80s. They're definitely a little more sophisticated than the earlier plank construction. Talking with my architecture professor, Gordon Tiao, he was talking about how the tongue and groove formed a stress skin and the hip roofs acted as a folded plate. So structurally, they're actually fairly sophisticated, difficult to calculate. But they just work through obstinance and redundancy, I think. Lewis and Cook published a catalog. This is probably from the 30s, and there's some nice diagrams of the single wall, 3/4 inch tongue and groove single wall, and the board and batten versions. This is actually really a wonderful resource for historic buildings. So some of the challenges that we have in trying to rehabilitate or reuse single wall. They were once touted as the least expensive type of construction, but now we know, especially now with lumber prices, you have to use a fairly high quality lumber, which is an increasingly costly resource. Building codes enacted in the late 1990s, probably with the 2003 code in particular, no longer permitted new single wall construction, although you could repair existing. They're difficult to retrofit for continuous load path and for hurricane resistance, although we'll talk about some innovations that have helped with that. And meeting energy codes with uninsulated walls is very, very difficult. So air conditioning these buildings is difficult to do within especially the 2018 IECC that's in effect now, 2015 that's in effect now. So other than that, the other thing that we're faced with is a loss of a generation of the traditionally skilled carpenters that actually knew how to build these. Many times when we've done work on single wall buildings, we've had to bring the old timers out of retirement to show the younger guys how to put them together. Again, I mentioned the continuous load path. You know, you have to be kind of tricky with your tie downs. We do these composite footings. It looks like a tofu block, but it's cast as a single piece with a larger pier that gets buried under the ground. There's a strap that goes through the termite shield and at least ties the pier to the foundation. If you're taking the siding off, you can tie the post to the sill, and then but it's very difficult to get the continuous load path that you would get in a conventionally framed stud wall. Simpson Strong Tie came out with what they call the Hawai'i plantation tie to tie the rafters to the top plate. We use these quite a bit. They're not great because they go on the outside of the building, but it's better than having your roof fly off. So we put these on and we paint them out, and they're still visible. Another challenge is, other than insulation and energy codes, is just running wiring around in these buildings. You know, we have to use surface mounted raceway. That's okay still under the code for residential, from what I understand, but you can't use wood wire molding commercial construction. So you've got, Romex or conduit exposed in these buildings, unless you can poke through the floor or come in through a closet or someplace where it's concealed. So it's hard to do that sensitively. So despite some of those challenges, we've still been able to preserve and adaptively reuse single wall plantation housing in many communities across the islands. And I'm going to share just a couple of case studies. Some of them are former sugar and pineapple camps that have been restored for continued use by agricultural workers. One is a living history museum that's kind of a what I call a building zoo, where the buildings have either been moved in or reconstructed to demonstrate various either ethnic or cultural facets of the plantation community, or different building forms, kind of like the facility in Bucharest, I would think. And then one is a luxury beachfront resort on Kauai, comprised of relocated plantation era structures. So some of the case studies, we'll start with the Granddaddy Grove Farm Homestead. This is probably the most authentic of the case studies that I'll share with you. Barnes Risnick, when he was with Grove Farm, preserved the big house for the Wilcox family, Miss Mabel's home. But they also had a workers' cottage that was in its original location quite near the main house, that's been interpreted as a demonstrate how the workers lived on Grove Farm. And then the balance of the housing, or some of the balance of the housing, some's been torn down and reconstructed, but they have some housing that's been rehabilitated for retired workers to live in. It's a really quite a lovely facility, and it's very authentic, has a high degree of integrity, historic integrity. Another case study would be Ewa Villages and the work that the city has been doing out there. Just recently in the paper, the past couple of weeks, they've been talking about a third neighborhood that they're going to rehabilitate and open for sale at Verona Village. They've done Renton Village and Tenney Village thus far. But Ewa was always a very progressive plantation, and its housing stock is particularly good. When the plantation ceased operations in @76, a lot of the housing got demolished. But then a decade or so later, the city took over at least 300 of the houses in Renton and Tenney, and worked with a nonprofit development corporation to restore and sell them to agricultural workers with low-cost housing. And then some have been sold to the public at large. I know 2 airline people that live in a house in Renton that they purchased. There's a community association that reviews the plans. There's a homeowners association. It's a very active and strong community. Seems to be fairly successful. Kunia Village is a more recent example of much the same. When the pineapple production ceased in 2007, the houses, many were torn down, many were retained. A not-for-profit developer stepped in. We worked with them to restore 45 of the historic homes dating from the 30s and 40s. And then the developer worked with, I think it was Honsador Homes, for 37 new homes in the character of the historic. These were all made available to low-income agricultural workers. Kunia Village was put on the historic homes were put on the National Register of Historic Places, and the developer took advantage of the federal historic preservation tax credits. It was a tax credit project that we did with them. They get 20% tax credit on their development costs. So, and that's been, I believe that's been fairly successful as well. Shifting gears a little bit here, this is Hawaii's Plantation Village. We worked on this in the early to mid 90s, just as the plantations were closing down. Again, this is kind of a building zoo where there was a combination of existing historic buildings. There had been a rice plantation. There was a Chinese Tong building or fraternal organization building on the site, and the cookhouse from that facility remained. That was restored. We had a pretty good idea what the Tong building looked like. That was reconstructed on the site. And then the balance of the other 25 or so structures were reconstructed from the Hawaii Sugar Planters Association's 1919 plans and buildings that we measured from around the state. If you have kids or grandkids, the school trips go out here and they play plantation games and they walk through the village. They also, in Halloween, they have a pretty good ghost tours. It's kind of a fun thing to do out there. But this is primarily an educational facility, but the structures are very authentic. We milled the lumber to the historic size per the plans or the building we were replicating. And it's been out there long enough that it's starting to really age into itself. It looks it's worth visiting. It's worth maybe taking people from out of town in particular. And then one of the last case studies is we actually were not involved in this as an architecture on the as a project for our office, but Waimea Plantation Cottage, the Faya family has developed this out in Waimea, Kauai. Many of the buildings were original to the site. Many were moved in from elsewhere on Kauai, and some were newly constructed in the character of the old buildings. But what's nice about this facility is that it's a good example of heritage tourism and lets visitors experience places that authentically represent Hawaii's past. That's kind of what I wanted to share with you. I have a couple of resources for if anybody wants to know more. I actually have a copy of the Lures and Cook plans if anyone's interested in that. This last example, this is in a state park in Haena on the north shore of Kauai. We recently rehabilitated this and another cottage that used to belong to the Allertons for use by the park rangers. This was an interesting facility because it had been a Hawaiian family had lived here historically, and there was when we opened up the floor to do some repairs, we found the remnants of the foundation of the original hale pili, the grass house that this house had been constructed over. So just long time habitation up there in Hyena. It's the last of 2 residential structures in the state park there had once been hundreds. So rare remaining resource. And that's what I have to share. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them or go back and look at any particular slide or drawing.
So Barbara, you've got one of these.
Oh,
from
thank
your-
you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
All right.
So we presented that in 2014, and we'll try and get this copy to you as well. And as Lee Mansfield likes to point out, even former Mayor Fossey does not have one of these.
Privileged group. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity, for your attention.
Yes, well,
Thank you,
thank you
Barbara.
very much. We appreciate it. It's a very interesting subject.
We can all give a round of visual applause here if you're good.
Okay.
Barbara and Sam, this will conclude the formal meeting is now adjourned. Watch episodes and offer your comments and insights in an email to eahawaii@gmail.com.